Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 317. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today I'm here with Max Schneider. Max, how is it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here, man. Now, people in our community are probably very acquainted with your partner, who is one of our sponsored athletes and on our rolling review coaching team. But you're new to the podcast. Why don't you tell everyone a bit about who you are?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I've been grappling for around 22 years now. I started in judo, national champion judo, Olympic training partner. Then I started wrestling in high school, two-time Illinois state champ, wrestled D1 for Cal Poly, went back to judo, and then went back to wrestling. D1 clock had expired, so wrestled D2 for San Francisco State, where I got my bachelor's in biochem. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for about 4 years now, and I got my black belt under Justin Flores. But yeah, no, just a old mat rat that never quit.
Nice. And of course, what you're probably best known for with a background like that is takedowns. And that was the topic that you had suggested talking about here today, was how to approach learning these. And there's a lot of directions that we can take this conversation. We can talk about how to speed up your learning. We can talk about how to introduce this to the room. We can talk about how to train these safely. But I'm going to turn this over to you first to maybe approach this from a high level. What is your philosophy on takedowns in jiu-jitsu, both from a wrestling and judo perspective and, of course, a native to jiu-jitsu perspective? And what do you think about the way that people train these in the sport of BJJ?
Yeah, so it's really interesting how takedowns play a role in jiu-jitsu, but it really kind of comes down to the rule set of how big of a role do they play. So, there's lots of benefits to learning takedowns, top position, scoring points, dictating the pace, or just being a complete grappler where you don't just feel the need to sit down every time. You can find the right time to pull guard because you are comfortable on your feet and you can go a little bit deeper into the water and maybe even make them think that you're going for a takedown and then surprise them with a guard pull. So there's a lot of different ways that takedowns can be important within jiu-jitsu, but it's really important that you do train them safely and you learn how to implement them effectively. Yeah, so I think with the fundamentals of takedowns, you kind of hear this back and forth now currently, whether or not you should avoid warmups, do warmups, take the ecological approach. And for takedowns, I believe warmups are fundamental and extremely required. There's a correct way to fall. We need to practice it. So starting off your practice with learning falling techniques and making it habitual where you consistently go on the mat and practice falls. Even me, I've been practicing takedowns my entire life, pretty much ever since I was 5. And every time I step on the mat, I do a couple breakfalls. It really grounds me with my practice and really makes me comfortable making contact with the ground. So drilling your falling techniques is a crucial part of the warm-up. So, you have your front falls, side falls, back falls, and your rolling falls. And coming from judo, we have a very particular way of doing our rolling falls, which whenever I teach a takedown class for jiu-jitsu, this is probably where I get hung up the most. I ask people to do the rolling falls and they do the traditional jiu-jitsu roll where you cross your feet and you stand back up. And in judo, you do your rolling fall as if you get thrown with a forward throw and you land on your back, so you won't be able to stand back up. So learning how to do that rolling fall where you land flat, feet not crossed, slapping the ground. You kill all the momentum and then you can stand back up. So, that warm up is how I fundamentally start my approach to takedowns.
Interesting. So when we're talking about rolling falls, when someone rolls through, because I know exactly what you're talking about, when you see jiu-jitsu people do their warm up down the mat and they're doing, say, shoulder rolls, they tend to roll and go right through and kind of come back up to their feet. Are you saying that you like to stop and slap the mat on the way to dissipate the force?
Well, I'm saying when you do that rolling fall, you should not end up back on your feet. You should end up flat on the ground.
Got it. So you're never doing a break fall where basically it's like a gymnastic roll where you just get right back up. You're always acting as if you've been thrown and you need to dissipate the force.
Yes. And as you get more advanced, you can come back up to your feet. But I feel the missing link is learning how to land flat and then get back up. Everyone kind of skips the piece where you fall on the ground, you lay there, and then you stand up. Everyone just skips right over that, where in an actual takedown scenario, there's no way you're rolling back to your feet.
Absolutely makes sense. This reminds me of something I've talked about many times, which is that the way that many jiu-jitsu schools do a warm-up where you do something down the mat, whether it be shrimps or rolls over your shoulder. Often when you do that, you lose the focus of why you're trying to learn that movement. The example I often give is when you hip escape down the mat, you're trying to travel a lot of distance, which is not actually the way that you would use a hip escape when you're training jiu-jitsu. It's more about kind of freeing yourself, and the motion often isn't as big and explosive as you would do if you were trying to shrimp down the mat. And similarly, if you're doing shoulder rolls down the mat and your goal is just to travel distance, if you lose that opportunity to break fall, you bring up a good point. Does that really simulate the purpose of a fall anymore? Maybe not, because if you're actually getting thrown, it is unlikely you're going to be able to just roll and get back up to your feet.
Correct. Yeah.
So this all raises an interesting question, though, about break falls. I've heard so many people say that in stand-up, the one thing that really everyone should learn, not just for self-defense, but just for life in general, is how to break fall. Because probably most of us who train martial arts, we're really never going to actually use this in a self-defense situation, hopefully. Probably you're not going to need to learn how to pull a guard and sweep someone and get on top in a real fight. That we train that, but we hope that we never have to use it. But one thing that will probably happen to most of us at some point in our life, especially as we get older, is we're going to take a nasty fall. And learning to break fall is so key to preventing damage that can happen when you do take that fall. And so we're not talking just about someone pushes you or someone throws you. This could be as simple as you slip on a banana peel. Or, of course, as we get older, it becomes more likely that this is something that could happen to us and to really hurt us. So I've heard many people say that if you're learning martial arts, the one most fundamental thing, even before self-defense, is to learn how to fall. I'd love to get your thoughts on that and if you agree with that statement.
Oh, 100%. I think it's something that should be integrated with our school physical education curriculum. You see it happen in other countries, Japan, France, where judo is more closely tied to their education system, where people do learn how to fall. But yeah, no, my father started judo, I think at 35 white belts, and he is a black belt now. But along his journey, I grew up in Chicago, just a little backstory. So he was walking out our front door, cement stairs, icy, slips, does a judo roll, lands on his feet at the bottom. So perfect roll, zero damage taken. And I think it's a perfect example of how proper training and understanding can really almost pretty much save your life.
This all raises the question, if break falls are so important, how should we actually teach them? What does a good break fall feel like? Because I think I know the answer, and I'm sure most people who've trained for a while feel relatively confident in their ability to break fall, but also I would guess that most people who train jiu-jitsu don't really spend that much time on their feet. So you can quite easily get to the point where you are a black belt in jiu-jitsu, but you're still very much a white belt in judo. And again, maybe we can talk about whether that's a problem or not. But before we get there, if I'm trying to learn a good break fall, explain to me what that should feel like. And is there anything specifically that I want to avoid that would be a signal that I'm doing it wrong?
Pain. We really want to avoid pain. So a good break fall should not hurt, especially if you are performing it by yourself. So it's kind of a physics equation here. So we have contact time and surface area, and then the force absorbed over that surface area during that contact time, right? So during a rolling breakfall, you would like to increase the contact time and increase the surface area as much as possible while having a large event that you can displace a good amount of force with, the slap. So by rolling over your shoulder, right, making contact all the way up your arm, across your back to your feet, you are essentially creating a nice arc in which each piece of the arc absorbs the same amount of force, and then you concentrate the rest into a slap with your hand. So throughout that like dissipation of force and a large isolated event of absorbing the rest of the excess that you weren't able to roll off, you should not experience pain. You should maybe feel a sting in your hand, but you should not experience pain.
That's a good point. And you've touched on something here that is always worth pointing out, just how surface area works. We've talked about this before on the podcast that in jiu-jitsu, we talk about pressure all the time. What is pressure mechanically? It is a ratio of force to surface area. The more force I deliver through the smaller the surface area, the more pressure I've got. That's why when I stab you with something pointy like a knife, it's going to do a lot of damage. Whereas if I stab you with something that's a bit broader like a spoon, it's not going to. In jiu-jitsu, of course, this matters because if we put less surface area on top of our opponent when we're trying to hold them down, it delivers more pressure and it can be more painful. But when you're doing a breakfall, the opposite applies. You want to hit the ground with the most surface area possible because that will dissipate the force. And that's the reason why when people break fall, they make themselves big. They put their arms out and they slap the mat, right? They're trying to distribute that surface area so it's not all hitting them on the ribs or the shoulder or whatever else they were landing on.
Yeah, exactly. And making a smooth roll rather than clunky roll, like even distribution is extremely important.
The other thing I'd like to ask you, you mentioned that this isn't just about hitting the ground with maximal surface area, but that it's also about contact time. And that's something that I haven't heard before. I'd love to maybe dig into that a little bit.
Yeah. So if you decrease the contact time, you increase the force absorbed during that time. So if you hit the ground and you spend 2 seconds making your way to the ground, of course, that's an exaggeration. It's more like half a second or a second. But if you increase that contact time twice, you half the force you absorb over that contact time. So by rolling, you increase the contact time and you decrease the force absorption per second.
Makes sense. It's interesting you bring this up because in jiu-jitsu, we don't teach this aspect of delivering force in bursts or over a prolonged period of time that often, but it's something that comes up a lot, especially in moves and techniques where timing really matters and momentum really matters. The example I sometimes give is imagine that you've got a whip. If you want to do damage with a whip, you have to crack the whip, right? You have to make it so that all of the force gets delivered in a split second. Otherwise, I'm just kind of trying to hit you with a wet noodle. There's an art to making sure that when I crack this thing, it maximizes the force. And in jiu-jitsu, you sometimes hear this described as constant tension versus variable tension. The idea being that I'm either holding you down and I'm providing consistent force over time, or I'm kind of not really providing much force and then I hit you with everything all at once, like I'm hitting you with a car. And this is how you're going to have to hit a lot of those judo throws, right? If I'm consistently tense the whole time, it can be hard to get enough force to really send someone. Whereas if I'm loose and then I crack like a whip, I can deliver it all at once. But I never thought of applying this in reverse, which is when you're the one who's hitting the ground. How do you do the reverse of this and make sure that you're maximizing the contact time of the impact rather than just taking it all at once? Because like you said, that will distribute the damage and make it easier for you to land safely.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So you talked earlier about the different types of breakfalls. It might be a good idea to run through these and just explain to people what they are and why you would choose one over the other. So of course, you talked about like a side breakfall, a rolling breakfall. I presume another option would be a straight flat back breakfall, but tell me about the different ways that you can land and if there's pros and cons to each of them.
Yeah, so we have directional falls to all sides, so left, right, front, back, and a rolling fall. And I would say the most applicable is a rolling fall, and a rolling fall is highly related to a side fall. So a way to isolate your rolling fall is to just practice a side fall. So if you were to lay on your left side and slap with your left hand, right, that would be the optimal position if you were to do a right-sided rolling fall. when you do the rolling fall, you should end up in a side fall position on the ground. So practicing your side falls will improve the fundamentals of your rolling falls. And those two are the most important. The front and back falls, less so important, but still best practice to learn. I still practice and still make my students do back falls. I do not make them do front falls. Front falls, you slap from your elbow to the tip of your finger by increasing the surface area. So rather than just falling on your hands where you could break your wrist, you go elbow to tip of finger to increase that surface area on both sides. But relatively unlikely that's going to happen. And most of the time I fall forward, I just do a roll instead of falling on my hands.
Now, I presume that what you're going to say is that a lot of good break falls involves understanding the situation and using the right option. Because when you're flying through the air, you don't really have a choice as to what direction you're going to land in. So you kind of have to be equally good at and willing to use all of these options, correct?
Yes. And the most likely to happen are like a side. Very rarely do you get taken down straight backwards. And the back fall is when you get taken down straight back. Maybe if someone ran a blast double and didn't cut the corner, but ran straight through you, you would have an opportunity, a backwards break fall. But there aren't very many other situations where you don't get thrown to one side.
Yeah. Now, in terms of how you train this and teach this to people, I'd like to know how you fit break falls into a broader curriculum. So if you've got someone who is new to the martial arts and they want to learn how to do takedowns, obviously you have to make sure they know how to break fall first. You mentioned that for you personally, you always get a few break falls in before you start training. But for people who are maybe newer to the martial arts, how do you recommend that this become part of their practice when they're learning how to do takedowns, perhaps for the first time ever?
Yeah. So I put my students through line drills, but if your teacher doesn't put you through line drills and you still want to practice this independently, show up to class early. It's really good practice to be 5-10 minutes early for class. Hopefully you can step on the mat and you can do your own specific warm-up. And being a competitor, it's very important that you develop a warm-up routine so that you can go back to it during competition and you can feel comfortable with your warm-up routine. But even if you're not a competitor, it's really best practice to have something that you do that acclimates you to your surrounding. Say you're in a new gym, you traveled, you're at this open mat, you don't know anyone, you feel a little weird, uncomfortable. Going back to your warm-up where you like do your break falls, you do X, Y, and Z stretches, you do whatever you need to acclimate to your surroundings. So show up early and have your routine.
Got it. And what would you say are some of the main mistakes that people make when they're integrating this into their practice? I mean, when you are talking about groundwork, of course, we want to make sure that we keep people safe, but at least you don't really have falling bodies when we're talking about groundwork. When we're talking about standing, of course, we need to be especially careful to minimize injury and to do it safely. Any things that you specifically look out for when you're training students to make sure that they're doing it safely? Anything that you want them to make sure they don't do? I would love to maybe hear both.
Yeah. So progressively increasing the resistance, right, is something that we often do in groundwork very well. And you see people being able to flow with almost no resistance to gradually more resistance. And for some reason, whenever people stand up, they don't take this lesson with them. It's like immediately like, oh my God, if I get taken down, I'm going to die. So I'm going to be so tense. I'm not going to have any type of give. So I think learning and teaching, like forcing them to have that progressive increase in resistance. So the first way I think is a stationary takedown. So you are on your feet and you take your partner down and you remain on your feet. So it's really important that you stay on your feet so that your partner can learn how to make contact with the ground by himself. And like a good scientific experiment, the results need to be repeatable. So you take him down, he lands. It should be the same way every time if you do it properly. You do the takedown, he lands the same way. In this, it becomes very predictable. And your partner learns how to successfully navigate going to the ground without throwing a bunch of variables in there. So you go from your stationary I'm going to take you down. I'm going to stay on my feet and disassociate from the situation while you go to the ground and make sure you are safe. Then it's like integrating more dynamic drilling where you still very much so have a 1-for-1, like I take you down, you take me down. And when I added dynamic drill, I put hard rules on it. And my first rule is you're not allowed to take someone down by falling down yourself. You must maintain top position the whole time. So this means no Tani Otoshi, no sitting on someone's knee and pulling them on top of you, and no sacrifice takedowns. And this builds a really good habit of maintaining top position during your takedowns and forces you to have a greater level of control.
This is something we should probably explain here, how the rule set factors into which takedowns you might want to prefer. So coming from a judo background, your goal is to get ippon, to throw someone with enough force and get enough of a clean throw that it ends the match right there. In jiu-jitsu, we don't score based on ippon. So it doesn't really matter how clean and pretty your throw is. What's most important is to get and maintain position. And I bring this up because that means in judo, you will sometimes see sacrifice throws that, if done improperly, could result in you landing on the bottom. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, that's always a factor you want to consider. And probably one of the reasons why throws like ippon seoinagi, the shoulder throw, are less common in jiu-jitsu than they are in judo. It's because in judo, you get the throw or you don't. In jiu-jitsu, if you mess it up, you've probably given up your back and the person might even have an arm around your neck to choke you with. So you've got different considerations. And I think that's an interesting realization that the rule set we play under dictates which takedowns might be a better option.
Yeah, of course. It's a huge consideration. Coming from judo, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, they all have different takedowns that I do based on the rule set.
So digging into those, for the people listening to this who will primarily be jiu-jitsu grapplers, what kind of takedowns pulling from judo do you think are the best options to translate to jiu-jitsu?
I think foot sweeps are extremely great options. Given the stance difference between judo, jiu-jitsu, and wrestling, I think it's like a progression where wrestling has the lowest stance because you don't really worry about guillotines as much, where jiu-jitsu, you can still shoot like a wrestler, but you don't really want to show the crown of your head, so you raise your level a little bit. So just taking that progression of stance will also dictate the techniques you have available. And seeing as jiu-jitsu takes like the central role, I think that integrating wrestling is great, but they do stand up more than wrestlers, which make ashiwaza, your foot techniques, much more available.
So one of the great things about foot sweeps is that they are what I would refer to as a low commitment technique. They're something that you can do without being so committed to the move that you're going to be in trouble if you fail. So compare that to something like tomo inagi, where you're trying to get onto the floor and throw the person over your head. It's a very effective throw, but it's a sacrifice throw. If I mess it up, I am now on bottom and the other person is on top, which I want to avoid. The thing about foot sweeps that's great is they're very low commitment. I'm basically just trying to tap my foot against your leg. And as long as I don't allow you to grab my leg and turn it into a single or a double, I can do those all day long. And so the thing I like about foot sweeps is they're kind of like the equivalent of a jab in jiu-jitsu, where you can really just pepper people with them as long as you're not allowing them to time you and grab your leg. And what that means is that's a tool for controlling the distance. And it's also a tool for keeping your opponent busy. Because if you're constantly threatening with foot sweeps, that's one thing that they're always going to have to be mentally occupied on. And that can take their focus away from other things that you might be trying to do, like collar drags or something. So I'm always looking in jiu-jitsu for these low commitment techniques where I can use them reliably without having to worry about, is this going to be turned against me? And often that's an important consideration with any move, not just how effective is the move if I get it, but also what is the consequence if I fail? You always need to keep both of those things in mind when you're choosing which move to do.
Yeah, no, the low risk but high reward is definitely that sweet spot. But with that low risk, there's often some trade-off in difficulty to perform.
Now, maybe digging into that a bit, does it matter if there's trade-off in difficulty to perform? Because you could make the argument, much like how a boxer may not be expecting to knock out their opponent with a jab, often we may not expect that our first foot sweep is actually going to work, but we might be using that as a way to keep our opponent off balance and to keep them focused on something else and to manage the distance. Do you need a throwing technique to be super high percentage all the time? Or from a strategy standpoint, are you ever using those to set up something else?
Oh, I think foot sweeps from a strategy perspective are my number one tool. I mean, of course, hand fighting sets up the foot sweep. So hand fighting might go above the foot sweep. But as far as like an attack goes, foot sweeps are my number one go-to. You can change people's stances with foot sweeps. You make them feel uncomfortable on their feet. If you consistently foot sweep, they don't have the ability to set their feet and produce a bunch of force. So there's a lot of benefits to executing foot sweeps without needing to actually throw anyone.
Yeah. With foot sweeps specifically, do you find that these are dependent on body type, body size? Do you think they favor people who have longer legs, or do you find that these are relatively adaptable no matter what?
I think they're adaptable no matter what. I am 5'6" myself, but foot sweeps are my go-to takedowns when someone weighs 220 plus. If I'm going against drilling or fighting with someone who is 220 or above, I pretty much won't do any takedown other than a foot sweep.
Yeah, that's an interesting realization. Many judo throws involve loading up the person's body weight on top of you and using yourself as a fulcrum to tip the person over. So I think of something like ogoshi or uchimata. You're really trying to load the person up onto part of your body and then have them kind of fall over just because of the momentum. And those types of throws can be very hard to do against someone who is much, much bigger than you. So in a situation like that where I'm giving up a lot of size, I would be looking for moves that don't require me to use my body as a fulcrum. So that means things like foot sweeps would be a great option. I also love single legs for this reason, because I never need to pull all of your body weight on top of mine to get that. And I find that makes it much more effective against a larger opponent.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Now, one other thing that I would want to ask here, when it comes to how we game plan and how we figure out what kind of takedowns we want to integrate to our games, you know, one of the cool things about judo is that there's a whole bunch of different throws, but not everyone leans on the same ones. Everyone has kind of a few that they really specialize in. How do you encourage people to figure out what the sweet spot is for them and what kind of throws are going to be the best option for them?
Yeah, this is interesting because in judo, we have a system of doing this. And when I was getting my black belt in jiu-jitsu, I kept asking, what does a black belt mean? Because in judo, it's very systematized. Like a black belt in judo is someone who knows all the throws, can perform them, and they've understood the like bachelor's degree curriculum. So getting a black belt in judo is kind of like getting your bachelor's, where you know all the material, but you haven't gone into industry to implement it as much. Or maybe you have because you've been doing it for 5. But in judo, when you learn all the throws, you definitely are more attracted to some than others. And while you may know them all, you find your niche and your positions that you like playing.
And from what I understand, they call that Tokui Waza, the idea of kind of figuring out what your number 1, maybe number 2, number 3 techniques are, and then building a game around that. And that's kind of interesting because in jiu-jitsu, a lot of schools don't evaluate knowledge that way. They kind of evaluate based on breadth, where there's an expectation that you know a little bit about everything. And that's something that I see sometimes when I look at people's curriculums for how they determine if you're a blue belt or whatever. They've got a checklist of moves they want you to know. And I've always found that to be an interesting approach because, you know, you can be a very effective black belt and still have areas of the game that you just don't really like to play. As long as you're able to prevent other people from doing it to you, that's okay. So I mean, I would never say that to be a black belt, you must be an expert in spider guard, because there will be very good black belts who just don't play that. And I think that's an interesting thing about judo, where they realize that and they allow you to, again, almost like in academia, they allow you to pick an area of focus and really zoom in on that.
Yeah. And as long as you understand what spider guard is, you don't have to play it. You just have to understand what you are dealing with.
Right. Now, when we get people to start training takedowns, we have to talk about safety, right? Now, granted, you could argue that maybe the concerns about safety are overblown because in jiu-jitsu, we're so biased towards the groundwork that sometimes we get, I think, a bit scared about standing up. I'd like to talk a bit about this with you and how we integrate this into a training practice. So how do you get people who are maybe jiu-jitsu athletes already and they're more comfortable on the ground to kind of put aside that instinct to sit down and to get them to stand up? Especially as a coach, I'm assuming you've got games or drills or practices that you do to make sure that people maximize that training time. Is it just a matter of we just run a judo class, or do you have a different way of approaching this for jiu-jitsu athletes?
Yeah, I definitely have a different way of approaching this for jiu-jitsu. And doing the stagnant drilling of the takedowns is great, and probably the first thing I'll start with when teaching a takedown class. But then moving it into a more progressively resistant drilling where you have 1-for-1 takedowns. I take you down, and even though I am maintaining top position during the takedown, I will progress to the ground with you. And this is something that you see in wrestling, and we call it hands-on drilling, where your hands never leave your partner. During the entire drill, you guys are connected. So as I take you down, I don't just stand over you like a judoka would, but I follow you to the ground, meaning top position. And bottom guy, your role is to not start playing guard, but it's to find a way back to your feet. So in practicing like this, not only are you practicing your takedowns, but uke is practicing their falling, as well as how they would navigate escaping that takedown to return to their feet. So in practicing those two, you can build a very cooperative drill with your partner. And to move it on to even more specific, I go to a drill which is takedown to submission. And this teaches my students that even if you like a takedown, you may not like where you end up. Like if you do a single leg and run the pipe, and then you end up in headquarters and you're like, wow, I don't really like being in headquarters. And it's like, okay, maybe I should have stepped to the outside during my single leg and ended up more in a leg drag. So in that takedown to submission, it really builds the pathway and understanding of where you're going to end up in your takedowns.
Now, you talked about how you start people off by having them stay standing when they complete a throw, just so that you can get reps that are as close to each other as possible and as predictable as possible. But you mentioned then that once people are comfortable with that, you have them start following their opponent to the ground. Of course, in jiu-jitsu, that is tremendously important. It is better to score an ugly takedown and follow the person to the ground than to score a beautifully clean takedown and just let them get back up again. That's one of the main differences between judo and jiu-jitsu is the fight doesn't end after a powerful throw. You then have to control the person on the floor. The challenge that can come up with this is when you throw someone and follow them to the ground, now your body weight is going to crash on top of them. So they're getting hit with force from two directions. They are landing on the ground, and you can break fall and dissipate the force against the ground. But then you've also got body weight falling on top of you, and that's a lot harder to brace yourself against. How do you train that safely? So when you add that level, you tell people, okay, fall to the ground with your opponent, take top position. You also don't want this person to land on someone so hard that they break their ribs. So how do you make that safe?
Yeah, no, this is a really great point. So when you drill and you stay stagnant and you stay standing when your partner falls, it allows you the option to decide when you're going to progress down with them. So if I throw you with a taiotoshi and I'm on my feet, I get to choose when I go to the ground. Where if I threw you with a taiotoshi and I fell down with you, I lose the ability to control where the position is going to end up. So in that, finding a moment of separation where you can reposition during their fall allows you to safely kind of come down in a lighter manner. You don't have to land on top of them where the roll through is more prevalent, but you can throw them, disconnect, and then re-engage as they have hit the ground in the way that you want.
Got it. So you're almost kind of like loosening up there for a second. Would you do this in competition though? Because of course in competition, you know, if you've got to land on someone and break their rib in order to hold the position, presumably you're going to be okay doing that. Do you change that strategy in competition? I presume you're more willing to put all of your body weight down, or is that still a problem because now you run the risk of letting the other person use your momentum to follow through and to roll through and get on top?
Yeah, I would say it's completely technique dependent. If I was doing a Harai Goshi and I had kind of like a headlock situation. I would not want to land and try to hold a Keisagatami. I feel like the back exposure is just a losing battle. So maybe I throw them, and as we're falling, I start loosening so I can turn towards the legs and end up with double unders rather than them having a far side underhook. So learning how to, yes, you are committed to going to the ground with them because you've done a headlock, but how do we progress the situation? I could bear down and try to bury you and squeeze you and pop your head, or I can throw you with the correct amount of force to get you down and then recommit the rest of my energy to transferring to a position where I have a more sustainable and positive outcome.
I see. Now, I would also want to ask you in terms of body type and size dependency, is it ever really safe to train takedowns with someone who is much bigger than you? Because in jiu-jitsu, I mean, if I want to drill arm bars on someone who outweighs me by 100 pounds, I can do it. You know, it might be obnoxious because it might just be hard for me to execute given that size difference, but I can do it safely, right? I'm never worried that that person is going to break my rib while I'm drilling arm bars. But with takedowns, it's a bit different, right? When you've got falling body weight and you've got momentum, all of that impact and all of that force can lead to injury. Do you ever let people, your students, train when there is a massive weight discrepancy? Or do you think, you know what, actually there is a way for people of different sizes to train safely together?
Yeah, this is a difficult problem. I would say if there is a huge weight discrepancy and a lower skill level, I would immediately quash that. I would change partners, go with someone your own size, something a little bit more realistic. But of course, as you increase in skill level, the heavier person knows how to like pull their punches a little bit. They know how to, maybe they throw you down, but instead of landing on you, they land on their forearm. So they're able to dissipate weight through themselves rather than through your chest. So as the skill level increases and the understanding of how to dissipate forces increases, you are allowed to practice with much larger people. And I do practice with large people all the time. I practice with a guy who's 250 pounds pretty much weekly, but he wrestled D1. He understands how to not hurt your partner while practicing, so it's okay.
Right. How do you square away the fact that in jiu-jitsu, it's actually possible due to the IBJJF rules to get pretty far in your journey without knowing takedowns at all? You could conceivably become a world champion without really having any takedowns, which is a criticism I have of the sport. Right? The way that we structure the rules under IBJJF rules, if I pull guard and sweep you versus if I take you down, that's really kind of equivalent, which I personally don't like. I think that being aggressive and being assertive and getting the takedown should probably be rewarded more. But the reality is you can be a guard player and be extremely effective. And so the problem is sometimes you get this curse of knowledge thing going where people are so good at this system they have that already works that it can be difficult to get them to go outside of that and to say, actually, no, you should be working takedowns. What do you do when you got someone who's already very experienced in jiu-jitsu and they just don't feel the need either consciously or unconsciously to train this because they already have a system that works?
Yeah. I mean, if that is the rule set that they are married to, and that is the worldview that they are married to, I just let them continue on. There's nothing I can really do to convince them that they need takedowns in their life. But if you want to be a complete grappler and you want to be able to go from the feet to the floor and maintain top position, you're going to have to learn takedowns. But that being said, if you want to play bottom your whole life, that is your choice. But you will be stuck within that rule set.
The thing I've always found interesting about takedowns is you actually don't have to be amazing at takedowns in jiu-jitsu to still get benefit from standing up and playing the takedown game. And by that, I mean, if you are willing to stand, you can really change the way that your opponent is forced to play the game. So many people are used to people just sitting down. They get predictable that way. But if you are someone who can alternate between the two, where you're playing guard and then all of a sudden you get back up, you maybe try a takedown or two. Even if you don't get it, you use the distance to time it and sit down into a stronger guard again. Even if you're not actually getting the takedown, just being able to threaten that and then switch your levels from being standing to seated to standing again to seated again. That in itself can be very effective because it makes it a lot harder for your opponent to time you and to know what you're going to do next.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Just the fact that you can threaten a takedown changes the way people will view you.
Now, I also want to ask you, we've talked a lot about IBJJF at this point, and of course, being a judo player, you're accustomed to wearing the gi, but a lot changes when you're going no gi, and especially with the rise of things like ADCC and CJI, you're seeing a different evolution of the takedown game in the jiu-jitsu sport from the way that it might be traditionally played via IBJJF gi rules. What are your thoughts on just the direction that the sport is going takedown-wise, and how would you train someone differently if their focus is, say, on no gi training versus gi training? I presume part of that, of course, is you're going to say, do some wrestling. But I'd also love to know, is there any judo that you bring over into the no gi world as well?
Yeah, I primarily practice no gi now. It's just what everyone is practicing. So when I go to pro sessions, usually it's a no gi pro session. It's where the meta has gone. And coming from wrestling myself, I'm comfortable no gi, but most of my wrestling is judo offense with wrestling defense. I do utilize wrestling offense as well, but it is usually set up by doing judo offense. People start defending the judo offense and they make wrestling overly available. But that being said, I think there's lots you can take from judo into the no-gi world. We've seen foot sweeps become incredibly prevalent. A lot of the bigger throws are harder to hit because slipping is a very real thing, but utilizing the threat of a large throw to set up other things will always be a good play.
When you talked about foot sweeps earlier, I was pretty sure that when we got into no-gi, you were going to say, I still use those, because one of the cool things about foot sweeps is you don't need to have strong, complicated gi grips to hold on to the person to get them. You just need to off-balance them enough, get enough kazushi that you can effectively trip them, right? It's more of a tripping sweep than it is like a load up onto my body sweep. And again, that makes them so versatile and so useful under so many different situations. I would want to ask, though, for people who want to expand beyond that, are there any more takedown strategies you like that have that same profile of a foot sweep, where it's low risk, it's low commitment, but it's still highly effective, so you can use it kind of like a jab to sort of pepper your opponent and to kind of use it to control distance and maybe set anything up? Anything else that you do from a stand-up perspective that has that same benefit?
Yeah. In wrestling, we call it short offense. In jiu-jitsu, it's like a front headlock. So like the guillotine situation, utilizing snap downs and head pressure to put someone's head below yours does the same effect of a foot sweep, where it consistently makes them work to raise their head back up, and it will fundamentally change their stance. If you keep pulling their head down, eventually they're either going to keep their head down because they got tired of raising it back up, or keep their head up and change their stance to not what they typically do, effectively changing the dynamics of their game. So I think utilizing front headlocks and short offense is another great way to fundamentally attack someone without needing to put yourself at a big risk situation.
Maybe explain that concept a little bit more, because that's terminology that's new to me. Short offense. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, short offense is essentially a front headlock situation where you have one hand around someone's chin and the other hand cupping their elbow or their armpit, and you're kind of like in this guillotine situation. And jiu-jitsu people typically attack submission once they get here, where wrestlers, they progress the positioning because you have to get behind them to score and you can't submit them. So rather than going the jiu-jitsu route and attacking submission, when you get someone's head lower than yours, you can consistently attack position and work towards a different control. So I use it a lot to get to the back. As soon as I get someone in a front headlock, I use my short offense to take their back. I often use a reverse body lock. So as soon as I get their head lower, I pull them under me and go reverse body lock. And from there, I can go crucifix or a half back position. And I use that interchangeably with foot sweeps and with foot sweeps as well. So like you can attack someone's foot, they move the foot, you pull their head down. So using both of those low risk techniques in combination, you can really generate very effective offense that is low risk.
So again, bringing this back to boxing, right? In boxing, it's common to use your jab to manage the distance and to give your opponent something to think about and force reactions. And in jiu-jitsu, I think we should all have this equivalent idea of an opening salvo, an attack that we can use to kind of set things up and break the ice and establish the distance so that then we can get in and hit with our power moves, with our equivalents of a hook or an uppercut. And so again, foot sweeps when you're standing are a great example of doing this. You bring up grabbing people by the head. I mean, that is always like a cheat code in jiu-jitsu. We can talk all day about how you control someone by the arm or the leg. But the reality is, if I grab you by the arm or the leg, that doesn't mean you're necessarily in big trouble. It might, but it depends on whether I do it a certain way. But if I grab you by the head, it is always going to be a problem for you. It is just incredibly hard to fight effectively when someone is latched onto your head. So I really like that point.
Yeah, no, it's short offense. I personally stand up pretty straight the whole time because I do not want anybody ever grabbing my head.
Yeah. And that's actually where you can get into interesting timing problems and timing solutions. I'm a shorter guy, and so for a long time, I kind of thought that grabbing people by the head and doing stuff like jump guillotines was just not going to be available to me, because if you're competing or sparring with someone who's like a foot taller than you, I mean, how on earth are you going to grab them by the head? And so at first I thought this just isn't an option. But then I realized at some point, you can time them. I don't have to pull you down so that I can grab your head. I can do other things that make you want to lower your posture down and make you want to get lower to the ground so that grabbing your head becomes more accessible. A good example of that, of course, is if you are threatening singles and doubles, people will always assume that access to their legs is a threat. And so then they will naturally kind of lower their center of gravity, and then it becomes easier to grab people by the head. So again, having a lot of different options, it's especially cool to time this with foot sweeps, right? Because then you're going low, high, and it makes it hard for people to really know what ultimately is going to be the setup that gets them taken down.
Yeah, no, extremely true. Attacking the legs with your hands or your legs will make them lower their level and defend, become smaller, and give you greater access to the head.
Got it. Now, one last thing I want to ask you, Max. If we look at judo, right? Judo in many ways could be considered a traditional martial art, although it's obviously much more effective than a lot of other martial arts that get that label. But one of the things about judo is it does use a lot of martial arts training methods that we could maybe consider to be more traditional. There's a lot of drilling. And there's a lot of shadow movement where you're practicing without even having an opponent. And in jiu-jitsu, we're seeing a move right now towards a more ecological based approach where there's a lot more kind of live practice involved. And the idea is that if you want to really learn something, you need a training environment to be as close to live as possible. And I wonder how you evaluate that concept when we're talking about something like stand-up. Because, like, look, it's all well and good to say that we should, kind of like train in an open system with constraint-based games. But the reality is, if you've got two white belts standing up trying to throw each other, there is a significant injury risk present that is maybe greater than you would see if people are on the ground. Maybe. I don't know. I don't have data on that, but it sure seems that way. I would like your thoughts on kind of how you feel this new move towards more open constraint-based training fits into something like judo, where the practice has always been more kind of traditional and drill focused.
Yeah, I think that in judo, we've seen somewhat of an ecological approach in some situations. At many clubs I've practiced at, the first round of sparring will be foot sweep only round. So they do sometimes put constraints on your sparring. And to further the point, Tokui Waza randori is further a constraint of the game, because as soon as it goes to the ground, you reset back up to the feet. Same thing with judo newaza. It's ground sparring. Is when you go back up to the feet, you return to the ground. So there are constraint-based games to a certain extent within judo. And I would say sequences and situational drilling is also found within that. You see it very prevalent with wrestling, where you start in a position and then you go live from there. The jiu-jitsu approach to like the game, as far as like the ecological approach, I think is good to a certain extent, but it's taken people thousands of years to truly understand this, as far as like maybe not thousands, maybe hundreds of years to understand how to optimize an uchimata. Whereas if you give a beginner a situation, they probably will struggle to reach the optimum answer. So I think it's good to teach certain skills, but from a technique perspective, I think it's very important to have these drills as well.
Got it. Makes sense. And I guess the last question I got for you here, Max, is, I mean, if you could change one thing about the way that jiu-jitsu people train takedowns, and I know this is a broad strokes question, but I'm sure you've seen patterns where you look at things and you get frustrated because people aren't doing it optimally. What's the one main thing that you think most jiu-jitsu people would benefit doing when it comes to integrating takedowns and getting better at these in the sport?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, honestly, it has to go back to proper falling technique and being comfortable turning your back. When drilling takedowns, you cannot effectively drill without standing back up. And the best way to stand up is to turn your back and stand up like a wrestler would. So I think learning how to fall and then learning how to safely expose your back to stand up to your feet. It's like, those are the two things I would change. One, builds really good back defense and turtle defense when you're consistently turning to turtle to stand back up off of being taken down, as well as making safe landing during the takedown.
I see. Well, Max, thanks so much for coming by and having this chat. Any closing thoughts or things you wanted to leave here for people listening to this conversation and interested in learning more? Just want to make sure that if there's anything you wanted to say that we didn't get to, that you get a chance to add that.
It's a long road. Takedowns do not happen overnight, just like being amazing at jiu-jitsu does not happen overnight. I encourage you, continue along the path. Don't get frustrated. Just take small incremental steps to learning and getting better. And if you want to learn more about no-gi judo, check out my YouTube channel, One Judoka, my Instagram, One Judoka, or you can see my Patreon as well, where I have my no-gi judo instructionals.
Well, that's as good a time as any to talk about that. Tell me a little bit about your Patreon. I know that you have a place there where people can go to learn from you directly. What kind of stuff should they expect if they sign up?
Yeah, so on my Patreon, I have series of techniques. I usually go from a position. So my overhook series, my underhook series, or my foot sweep, my no-gi foot sweeps for jiu-jitsu series. I also post training footage. So being in San Diego, I have incredible access to training partners. So you'll find rounds with me and PJ Barch, me and Kynan. Who did I roll with the other day? Me and William Tackett. You'll see all these takedown rounds with me and some really great competitors where you can go through and ask me questions about what happened during these rolls, what was my thought process, and we can have real intelligent discussion around how these takedowns are implemented in jiu-jitsu.
Nice. Well, I will put links to all of those in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. So just pop open your podcast player and go to info or notes or description. Easy way to find Max. All of the links will be there. I'll also put a link to our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. If you want every episode of the podcast we've ever done, or our amazing newsletter, or our database of mental models for jiu-jitsu, all of that is there completely free. If you want to take it up to the next level with us, you can join BJJ Mental Models Premium at the same place. The reasons you might want to do that is because we've built the world's biggest library of jiu-jitsu audio courses on strategy, tactics, mindset, concepts. There's a lot of jiu-jitsu sites out there that'll teach techniques. We avoid that and we talk about kind of the higher level stuff that's super important but tends to be missed. So if you listen to the podcast and you've always thought, man, I wish there were courses like this that were more structured and more long form, that's where you go to get that. You also get access to amazing ongoing premium podcasts that you can only find there. Emily Kwok and Johannan, their podcast is on BJJ Mental Models Premium if you want to listen to the highest levels. We've also rolled out State of the Meta with Drew Foster, BJJ Today with Andrea Tang. We're trying to build up a whole complete network of this stuff to give you a broad perspective into everything you need to know about the sport. And of course, you can also join our coaching tier if you want to go to the next level. We've got a team of elite black belts from around the world, including Rachel Ranshaw, someone, Max, that you're obviously very familiar with. So if you aren't getting the kind of direct focus and attention that you would like to get at the gym, which is very common because, you know, in a class of 30 or 40 people, it's just not realistic that the instructor will be able to really narrow in on your game. we can compensate for that, and we can also give you outside perspectives and high-level feedback that you just simply are not likely to get at a local facility. So again, join our coaching tier for more on that. And if you run a jiu-jitsu business, whether it be a gym or something else, I also always recommend checking out our stuff because we are expanding into a pro tier now where we're kind of leveraging the stuff we've done that's been successful here at BJJ Mental Models to help you automate things like lead generation and marketing for your business, something that I know that almost all gym owners hate to do. Luckily, we're quite good at that and we can do that for very little money. So anyway, all of that is at bjjmentalmodels.com. I will put a link in the show notes. But Max, thanks so much, man. This was a great chat. Really cool to talk about takedowns. I'm always interested to know how these conversations will translate to audio, but I think you did a great job of really talking about this conceptually and philosophically in a way that I think will resonate with people of all levels. So thank you for coming by.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, Steve. BJJ Mental Models is a great resource for everyone out there, and I look forward to listening to all future podcasts from you.
Thanks, Max. I appreciate that a lot, and thanks to the listeners as well. Appreciate you too. We'll talk to you in the next one. See you soon.